in order to properly introduce Minister Taylor, I want you first to welcome our Data Foundation board member, Booz Allen Hamilton Vice President Bryce Pippert.
Thanks, Hudson. And I know we're tracking a little bit behind, so I'll keep my introduction to the point and look forward to hearing from our speakers. I'll do a quick intro and moderate the international keynote, and then we have a White House keynote immediately following. And I was thinking back to last year's Data Transparency 2016, getting ready for this one, and the session that we had with Estonia CIO Taavi Kotka and the innovation that was happening in Estonia. And I just love that Hudson and the team are bringing some outside thinking into these sessions so that we can really explore the art of the possible. And I know for us at Booz Allen, we love having those innovative ideas and diverse thinking brought into our teams. But let me get straight to the introduction. Australia has been going through a digital transformation, and there's certainly some things that we can look to as examples and models. I'm very pleased to be introducing Honorable Angus Taylor today. He's Minister in the Liberal Party of the Australian House of Representatives, representing the Division of Hume in New South Wales. Most recently, he was sworn in as an Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister for Cities and Digital Transformation. Prior to his current role, Minister Taylor had a very successful career in business. After graduating with a master's degree from Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar, he worked for McKinsey, where he eventually became a partner. And before entering Parliament in 2013, Minister Taylor was a director at Porter Jackson Partners, where he was a strategy and business advisor across multiple sectors, including energy, infrastructure, and agriculture. And in public life, he's really gained a reputation as a problem solver with a passion for technology and a focus on the benefits of digital services to citizens. I'm really excited to hear from Minister Taylor about the transformation that's been happening in Australia, their standard business reporting initiatives. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thanks, Bryce. It's a real pleasure to be here in Washington. It's a great opportunity for me, and I really hope I can share some of the learnings we've had in Australia in recent years. But it's a particular pleasure to precede Chris Liddell at the lectern. Chris was a client of mine.
Beg your pardon, start fixing the screens.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Chris was a client of mine in Australia, or New Zealand, in fact, over 20 years ago. To Anisha's point, we've both been reskilled. At the time, I was advising him in the forest products industry. We're now both in the digital and data space, but this is not an attempted takeover from those of us down under. We are hoping, though, we can share, I'm sure Chris is as well, some of our learnings from recent experiences. Now, I'm not sure how familiar many of you are with Australia, but we have a long, grand tradition of innovations. From Wi-Fi, which was first developed in Australia, not something that's widely understood, Google Maps, ultrasound scanners, the application of penicillin, black box flight recorders, pacemakers, the stump jump plough, we have been innovators throughout our history. With a relatively small market, heavy dependence, very heavy dependence on international trade, high labour costs and a hostile environment across much of our continent, it has been sink or swim for Australia throughout our history. And mostly, not always, but mostly we've swum. Now the experience is just as relevant in digital and data, where we've had many successes in recent years alongside the challenges that all of us have faced, all governments have faced across the world. And one of the earliest successes of our government, without doubt, driven by the current Prime Minister, has been in data. Since we were elected in 2013, open data, data analytics and data management have been absolutely at the forefront of our innovation, and we've increased our open data sets by 5,500%. That was from a reasonable base, so an enormous increase in the availability of open data. We were only the second nation on Earth to provide open geocoded addresses for every premise and location in our country. We've delivered data analytics in our tax and welfare systems that have driven substantial benefits with much more to come. We've delivered data integration programs that will link and are linking tax, welfare, health, industry, education, statistical and geographic data across time to test and explore our policies. And this has enabled us to test a whole range of programs with real-world data. So as a data geek myself, someone who comes from a management consulting background, I know how enormously powerful this is. So in short, we've made data a real priority, and that's allowed us to deliver real-world leading outcomes. Now, much of the inspiration to deliver those sorts of programs is based on what both private and public sector organisations are doing across the world. And as a management consultant for many years, as Bryce said, I was constantly struck by the benefits of taking good ideas from across the world. And it's really fantastic to see here at this conference people sharing their learnings in this all-important space. And whilst we're great innovators in Australia, we're also great copiers. And we've adapted some of the best ideas from around the world. We've quite deliberately picked exemplars. So in recent times, we've learned from your experience in open data in the United States, from Israel in government procurement of IT, from New Zealand in creating longitudinal cross-agency data sets, which has been a real focus for that government, from the UK on how to break up IT contracts and become a much better buyer of IT and digital services. And I believe firmly that developing this melting pot of ideas is easier in a country which is in itself a melting pot of skilled immigrants with a very high skilled immigration rate across our history, coming from all parts of the globe. Similar to our success in bringing great people into our country, our success in data and digital is starting to be recognised with our ranking at the top of the Global Open Data Index, which is, as I say to my team, a good start, but we have much further to go. As well as learning from other governments, we're seeking to learn from the private sector. And for instance, I think that many government programs look very similar to what you see in the insurance industry. Just like insurance, we effectively charge premiums through taxes and levies, and we pay out claims when citizens need them in health, in welfare, in disability services. That gives us an enormous incentive to develop targeted programs so we can avoid the need for claims in the first place. And the better our data, the better we can target the programs at the right people and the right problems. For instance, we're doing that, we're seeking to do that with those suffering from drug and alcohol addiction through the establishment of a cashless welfare transaction card. It also means we want to ensure that the services provided to those in need, the government-funded services, are delivered at competitive prices. And we're seeking to do that with our new National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is essentially a voucher-based scheme where we encourage strong competition in the delivery of services to those with disabilities. And if all of that is to be delivered without raising taxes for our businesses and our consumers, our citizens, compliance is absolutely crucial. So payments from the government should go to the right people without fraud, abuse and error. And all of that requires accessible real-time data and great data analytics. Now we're focused on three streams: citizens, businesses and those entering and exiting Australia. And the business and entry and exit streams are by far the most advanced. And I'll talk a little more about some of those, but we've recently put an enormous amount of effort into citizen engagement. Now, in this world of digital disruption, I'm finding consistently that governments are experiencing a somewhat challenging realisation, and increasingly they are being compared to the private sector, and often, frankly, unfavourably. Now, governments are by their very nature monopolies, and they don't always love competition and comparison. But I think it is time for those of us who work in government to embrace competition and comparison as we never have before. And in Australia, we're seeking to meet this challenge by focusing on the core common platforms that will deliver digital services. And in particular, We're investing in digital identity, and it was good to hear Anish talk about the importance of digital identity. It's a real focus for us. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Notifications, tell us once, and a common data exchange across government. All of those platforms have emerged in the private sector first in some form or other, particularly in financial services, but they're very, very well suited platforms to government. So we have a number of brands like MyGov, MyTax, data.gov.au, Smart Traveller we use to deliver those services. For instance, you can now enter Australia through a fully automated system matching passport photos with real-time visual identification. We have 4 kids, my wife and I have 4 kids, and we come to the US on occasions, and I can tell you, at the end of a long trip home, this system is an absolute godsend with young children milling around. The time taken to get through immigration has shrunk dramatically, particularly at peak times, and I can thoroughly recommend it as someone who's come through LA many times as a technology that you too could use. Another example of the work we're doing is MyGov, which is the Australian government's primary digital entry point for citizens. That service had previously had serious usability and access issues. We've put together and overseen a multidisciplinary team from across government to begin fixing the problem, and we're turning it from a drain on our credibility to an exemplar of government delivering better services. And in particular, we've seen usage and logins dramatically increase in the last 6 months. We've maintained availability at 100% through the crucial times, and it's also now has a login statistic which is in line with what you see from the best of the banks. So that's a fantastic start, but we need to do much more. The next step is the most important. We've been focusing on the doorway into government, but now it's time to fix the rest of the house. One of those programs is to streamline the process for getting a tax file number, which is a prerequisite to working in Australia. You can't work in Australia without having a tax file number. Through our new beta trial of a streamlined process for data exchange and digital identity, we've taken a 30-day plus process, often 60 days, and reduced it to 4 minutes. This is a huge benefit to the 750,000 people who apply for a tax file number each year, and it'll also take 9 million tax file movements a year when someone changes a job and reduce the lead time from days to minutes. So as I mentioned earlier, data's been one of our government's great success stories. Our open data portal, which is called data.gov.au, I encourage you to take a look at it, has more than 28,000 data sets, around 52,000 distinct users a month, and many of the data sets, in an increasing proportion, are accessible via APIs. National Map, another one of our proud achievements, is an innovative spatial analysis tool for open government. It has 10,000 data sets and 12,000 distinct users each month. And we were able to use an agile methodology to produce this national map, or to develop it, at a fraction of the original forecast cost. The real challenge, though, is to deliver data that is high value and meets citizens' needs across every part of government. Another example is the GNAF, or the Geocoded National Address File. Think of it as a massive, real-time, accessible digital address book with exact coordinates for each residence. It's a fantastic example of releasing high-quality open data. Since its release over a year ago, the GNAF usage and downloads have exploded, and they're not just for interest, they're being used to develop solutions. We see many or most of the spatial applications in Australia now, including the big players, using the Geocoded National Address File. Now, many of the early wins in this field have been focused on how we interact with business, and Hudson mentioned a couple of those. The exchange of standardised data between the private sector and government, particularly around tax, has been strong. Through automation, standard business reporting, which Hudson mentioned, has reduced Australian companies' regulatory burden by about $1 billion a year, which for a relatively small economy compared to yours is a big improvement. We have a speaker from Australia who is going to talk more on that later today, and I encourage you to, I won't steal his thunder, but I encourage you to listen to that presentation. Fundamentally, the big idea is that multiple regulatory agencies can adopt a single open data structure for the information they collect from companies. And by doing that, you can get very, very significant improvements using third-party applications in the regulatory burden. Now, a common theme in all of this is something Anish mentioned earlier, is the idea of government as standard setter. I'm an economic liberal, and I do believe that the market is best left to its own devices whenever you can. But there are occasions, I believe, when government can play a crucial role, and I'm convinced that customer ownership, citizen ownership of data and access to a common digital identity for businesses and citizens is one of those areas where government intervention can have an enormous impact. In financial services, energy, telecommunications, as well as the provision of public services like health and education, consumers are struggling. They're struggling with a proliferation of plans and high barriers to switching between providers, and in our case, in many of those services, increasing costs. We believe that in the modern digital economy, access to open, standardised data and a common understanding of digital identity are the next great enablers of regulatory reform and competition policy. We've seen consumers take control of markets with taxis and accommodation through applications like Uber and Airbnb, but we need to broaden this very, very powerful idea of the consumer as a regulator. Frankly, well-informed consumers typically do a better job than regulators. Greater access to data and reduced switching costs will facilitate increased choice, better services, reduced outlays for Australians in energy, telecommunications, financial services and public services, and we're working towards a platform of policy, legislation and standards that is supporting and will support consumers to get a better deal. So to take an example of energy, consumers wanting to reduce their costs, which have been rising dramatically. We've seen 10 to 20% increases in electricity and gas bills in Australia in the last 12 months. Consumers wanting to reduce their costs need to make complex price and service comparisons using their own historical usage and also providers' plans. So to fix this, we need to allow energy users to own their own data. This will allow them, or more likely third-party applications, to make comparisons of available plans using that data. But we also need to make it easier to switch to a better plan. And that means having an easily accessible and fraud-proof digital identity. In practice, customers need to establish their new identity, or establish their identity with each new service provider, which, as we all know, is a painful process that deters many people from switching and deters or reduces competition in markets. In Australia, at least, we believe the government has a clear role in establishing this well-informed choice. We're doing this through two important work programs. First, we're responding to a recommendation given to us by one of our leading economic agencies, the Productivity Commission, which was essentially to make customers owners of their own data. And the second is the establishment of a set of standards and a platform for a common digital identity, which is being driven through my portfolio. So what do the interventions look like? The government's working with industry to develop a mandated and standardised set of APIs to make data easily available to consumers and their agreed third-party advocates. So the consumer owns their own data, the citizen owns their own data. Those standards are specific to each industry and will typically include usage history, pricing and package information. And that can be combined with a government-facilitated digital identity that allows service providers to accept pre-established identities with high levels of integrity. Finally, we can all start to jettison the endless lists of changing usernames and passwords that drive us all mad daily well, me personally at least, driven mad on a regular basis by that hassle. The initiatives are the bedrock that will allow any consumer to access a service better suited to them in a matter of minutes and with little hassle. As someone who has focused on competition policy through much of my career, this is a massive breakthrough, offering customers and businesses, I think, enormous benefits. So thank you for having me here today. I hope you can stay for John's speech on the standardised business reporting a little later on. I'll leave you with one thought. In our country and in yours, we have endless debates about whether government is too big or too small. Now, whatever your view on this, one thing we should all be able to agree on is that we need to make government work better. Open data alongside well-targeted government standards and platforms will be, I think, one of the great enablers of modern digital economies and better government. We'll get there if governments learn quickly from each other and from the private sector. The benefits to citizens and businesses make this project an enormously exciting one. Thank you.